Welcome everyone to our final session of Kohelet. As we conclude the book, was mentioned, we'll be concluding it, the last verse, Minyan, for our Siyum before Passover on April 15th. But today we're really going to conclude the book and talk about how we pull it all together. And that question, what is life about? What is the meaning of life? And this last chapter really continues with the strong themes that we've been reading about. But one of the most interesting part of the last chapter is that the voice changes almost at the very end. And it looks like that a different editor is concluding the book instead of Kohelet, giving it a final little twist. And we may be left with, well, what is Kohelet's view of what is the meaning of life? What is the editor's view of what is the meaning of life? What is our view? What is the meaning of life? What is Judaism's view of what is the meaning of life? Is the editor really an editor? Did what he add, is he just spelling out what Kohelet does not spell out? Or maybe it's not an editor, maybe it's Kohelet talking about himself in the third person and then giving a slightly different spin. But it's an interesting end to the book, and part of our conversation is, why is this book in the Bible, right? Why is this in the Bible? Of all the books, why is this one included in the Bible? Why is it one of the most quoted books in the Bible of this part of the Bible in modern culture, right? And then so many titles of books, so much. This book has made its way into our lives. So how is it relevant to who we are and where we are in our modern days? And how has it spoken to each of us through these months of study? So let's begin. And our tradition going back years is that Alan will start us off. Okay. So if I can get the technology to work. There we go. Okay. Alan, go ahead.
Okay. Chapter 12. So appreciate your vigor in the days of your youth, before those days of sorrow come, and those years arrive of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before sun and light and moon and stars grow dark, and the clouds come back again after the rain. When the guards of the house become shaky, and the men of valor are bent, and the maids that grind grow few or are idle, and the ladies that peer through the windows grow dim, and the doors to the street are shut, with the noise of the hand mill growing fainter, and the song of the bird growing feebler, and all the strains of music dying down. When one is afraid of heights, and there is terror on the road, for the almond tree may blossom, the grasshopper be burdened, and the caper bush may bud again. But man sets out for his eternal abode, with mourners all around the street. Before the silver cord snaps and the golden bowl crashes, the jar is shattered at the spring, and the jug is smashed at the cistern. And the dust returns to the ground as it was, and the life breath returns to God who bestowed it. Utter futility, said Kohelet. All is futile. A further word, because Kohelet was a sage, he continued to instruct the people. He listened to and tested the soundness of many maxims. Kohelet sought to discover useful sayings and recorded genuinely truthful sayings. The sayings of the wise are like goads, like nails fixed in prodding sticks. They were given by one shepherd. A further word, against them, my son, be warned. The making of many books is without limit, and much study is a wearying of the flesh. The sum of the matter, when all is said and done, revere God and observe his commandments, for this applies to all mankind. That God will call every creature to account for everything unknown, be it good or bad.
Okay, that's it. It's the
Oh.
end. The end of the whole book. So we see in some ways the book could have ended, and there was this last series of very beautiful, somewhat depressing images about end of life. And then it could have ended, other futility, says Kohelet, all is futile, right? And then that could have been the end of the book, right? That might have been the original end of the book. But then we have, well, let's further word, talking about Kohelet in the third person. And then we have this very last verse, the sum of all the matters, when all is said and done, revere God and observe his commandments. Whoa, where did that come from? Haven't talked about that really. And for this applies to all kind, so what do we make of these two sections? How do we bring it all together? And how does it all work with the rest of the book? The whole beginning of the chapter, before we get to the editor, is really one thought, isn't it? It's really about the what we've been talking about, the meditation on death and on the fleetingness of life, and on holding on to being and to life. We'll go through it in more detail. Anybody have any thoughts just from reading that? Okay. Let's then let's start to go through it. So appreciate your vigor in the days of your youth, before those days of sorrow come. And those years of which you will say, I have pleasure in them. Pretty clear what he's saying. So there's, as the A here indicates, we're not sure. That word borecha, which means vigor, could mean many different things. Could mean your creator, could mean your vigor, could mean others.
I appreciate the strength that you have when you're younger. When you were younger, because now you're on your way to the end of your life.
When you arrive at those years where I have no pleasure in them. No comment.
It feels like a very different view of aging than I think any of us, at least, would look at it as. I mean, it's a very bleak view of darkness, and nothing's going to be good, and it's like life is going to wane and things are going to be terrible, and you're going to be miserable. And it just seems like, for many of us, I won't say for everybody, but particularly those of us that keep coming to class here, I think we're in a very different position we have the ability to learn, and we can, many of us at least can travel. Some of us can travel. Some of us are hoping to travel. It's, it's, I don't know if it's typical of what life was like then, or, the view of aging men. But it's just very hard to relate to, for me at least.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll get to it, but the sun and light and moon keeps getting brighter. It's not getting darker, it's getting brighter. So powerful. Go ahead.
He might be talking about your vision, because as you get older, your vision is dimmer, and so you might not be seeing the sun and the light and the moon like you did when you were younger.
Yeah, that's what a lot of commentators think. All of these are seen as images to do with the body, right? They're the body kind of getting older. So you can't see the sun and the moon as well. And we've had this image of the rain throughout the whole clouds and rain. But then the guards of the house become shaky. You even have it here, and embedded within our translation. The guards of the house are the arms, and the men of valor are the legs, and the maids, the grind, are the teeth. The ladies that peer through the windows are the eyes. He may also be referring to the very end of life, not, and as we know back then, it might have gone faster in terms of the body, not having modern medicine to help. And the doors of the street are shut, the ears are shut, and the noise of the handmill growing fainter, and the song of the bird growing feebler, and all the strains of music dying down. So, but it is, if so much of his book has been about the senses and those who are gratifying and who are looking for power, and so if that's where your mind is at, then you can see that this feeling of older age, of that part of life not being as vital, is hard. And especially if we look at it in the context of Kohelet, the man who tried to have everything and absorb everything, and here he is at the end of life, and he's found that he hasn't been able to do it. And despite being king, despite having all his wives and all his riches, same as everyone else, his body is growing older.
So, Rabbi, so where is the joy? I mean, there are, obviously, everybody comes to the end of their life. But, he doesn't mention anything, that made him happy or gave him joy, other than just saying, watch what you do because you'll be held to account. So.
Yeah, it's hard because he has mentioned joy at times, and we began joy, and right again, fleeting Hevel might mean everything is precious and short, and his mood does seem very dark in this last chapter, doesn't it? His mood is quite dark. There's not much joy there. Maybe, this is what I thought that I was going to share later. Is maybe the editor came in and put in those last few lines about revering God, to say, hey, we don't believe in this. This is not who we are. We don't believe that this is the end of it. We want to add a thought to Kohelet, because we think Kohelet as an outlook of life is incomplete in how we understand, our tradition understands life. Because you're right, he's not mentioning joy. He's just mentioning everything. When one is afraid of heights and there is terror on the road, and thinking about, aging and driving and driving at night, and but
Yeah, like Rabbi, that, like in this one sentence where it says, for the almond tree may blossom,
Uh-huh.
which you would think would be, something that would provide joy to someone. But then he says, well, the grasshopper be burdened. So, if the grasshopper is burdened, imagine what it's going to do to the ants. It's like,
Mhm.
I mean, it's,
Well,
A lot of
but
this-
the almond tree blossoming in that context means that there's something fresh emerging. Like, for example, you could think of that when the sensations are dim, like, for example, the sensations are dim in the middle of the night when you're asleep. Strange things happen in the middle of the night. You have dreams, you have sort of contemplations which might move you in some way. So my sense of this is that the end of life with the diminishing of the sensations, which are your connection to the everyday world, the almond tree begins to blossom. Now, what's the almond tree blossoming? What is one's sense of what that experience would be, except for a sense of springtime, for a sense of rejuvenation, for a sense of hope? So there's something else that he's talking about here. And in fact, the most interesting line for me is this sixth thing, which line 6, where the silver cord snaps. I've spent about 40 years off and on wondering about that particular paragraph. And I still haven't got it completely, but there's certainly something else going on here. And he is revealing something about his metaphysics, about what happens at the end of life. And it's his metaphysics. It's a very personal thing.
Mhm. So the almond tree is one of the first trees to blossom. And the spring is coming. In my mind, the almond tree traditionally in Judaism, one of the beautiful passages in the Torah is when the children of Israel are traveling through the desert. There is a rebellion by Korach, right? Where Korach tells Moses, "Aren't we all holy?" And then there's a little spiritual battle, and the earth opens up and swallows Korach and all of his supporters. And then Aaron and all the heads of all the other tribes put their staves inside the ark. And Aaron's staff comes out and he has almond blossoms coming out of it, right? His staff has blossomed. So there might have been some kind of ancient, beautiful sense of almond tree blossoming having a spiritual connotation, something about spiritual life. And it does shift here. Our tradition views these verses very metaphorical, more about the body again, not working. I think as you were talking, David, I was thinking, the silver cord, let's get to that. I think that is a very in Kabbalah, that's a very a verse that has a lot of life too. But the it's like we die, but the almond tree continues to blossom. Life continues, right? The cycle of life. I feel that as being in the background here, right? The grasshopper be burdened, the caper bush may bud again, but man sets out for his eternal abode. So it's something about the cycle of life, the seasons passing, but at a certain point, man does go on to something else, right? Life goes on, we go through all the cycles, there's a season for this, a season for that, the great movements of life. But for human beings, part of our movements is going on to our eternal abode, and being mourned. Before the silver cord snaps. So, a lot of our medieval commentators who are not Kabbalists, who take all of these metaphorically, they say that's the spine, when your spine snaps, and you're dead, right? That's the jar is shattered at the spring, right? This is the jar of your physical life is shattered, the jug, right? This is the end of your physical life. in Kabbalah, it's a lot more complicated. The silver cord, in essence, does not snap. Though, I think here maybe only Morris is the one who comes to my meditation on Saturday, Sunday mornings. I talk about the golden thread, but really it's more of a silver cord that's really talked about most often. And the silver cord is our link to our soul on some level. So there's the silver cord is part of what links us to our higher domain. So maybe the silver cord snapping means that the silver cord that ties our spirit into our body snaps. So our body is, that sense you get when one sees a person who's passed away. You look at it. I remember my mother describing it too, but spending months with her mother when she was passing away, and when you see it's there, but at a certain point you look and it's not your loved one anymore. It's just like a piece of flesh there. It's just a body. You just look at it and it doesn't feel anymore. It's like what animated that body and was a person you love and know. That part is gone, right? That part is gone. It's just a body. And I remember her sharing with me how she had that very strongly, seeing her mother when her mother finally passed away. And even before she technically passed away, she had some of that sensation. But it is, this is a logical conclusion of everything we've been talking about. The book has gone more and more in this direction, right? Of talking about death and the fleetingness of life. And so this chapter makes sense, doesn't it, on some level, with all of that. And in itself, is powerful, both to, what matters, makes us think of the verse from Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, right? Know three things, before where you come from, a putrid drop, where you're going to, worms and dust and ashes, and before whom you stand, the sovereign of all sovereigns of all sovereigns. So there is something of that here, sense of, we know where all of our jugs are going to be smashed, our jars shattered. So what is the purpose of? But in this verse, the dust returns to the ground as it was, and the life breath returns to God who bestowed it, is often said at the end of funerals, right? This is v'yashav v'afar la'aretz. This is often what's said not only at funeral, but the very end, after, right before you do the shoveling, right? When the body's in the ground, you say these verses, and the dust returns to the ground as it was, and the life breath returns to God who bestowed it. It's not the sense that we've had earlier. There's a sense here of life continuing in some form, but there is a sense of how fleeting it all is, how short. Right? We talked about how futility can also mean a short breath, a fleeting breath, and somebody like Kohelet to spend his whole life trying to gather knowledge and trying to gather possessions and trying to learn everything and understand everything and gain no power. And now he's looking at the end of all of it, and he knows, I am just like everyone else, and I'm going to return to the ground, and my spirit goes on. And I have no idea what is going to truly happen. I'm going to have to give an accounting before the sovereign of all sovereigns. But what was it all about, right? What was it all about? What was all of it about? Anybody have any other thoughts just reading these last few bits?
The other thing about that silver cord is the use of the word Gilgal, which I'd like to point out that Maimonides spends one full chapter in the Guide to the Perplexed, Book 3, Chapter 4, talking about the Gilgal in respect to the Ezekiel mystery, and with respect to that. So this to me is also connected to the meditations that people must have used to understand and feel Ezekiel's image. So there's some connection between that particular verse and the Ezekiel mystery too. I'm not sure what the connection is, but there is a connection here.
What is Gilgal? Hagilgal?
So Galgal,
Gilgal, yeah.
yeah,
It means a sphere, a circle, or
Yes.
a wheel, I mean, and Maimonides spends a whole chapter actually talking about that particular word.
mhm. Well,
Excuse me.
Go
I
ahead.
just can you just tell me? I'm sorry. Where the word
Yeah,
Gilgal
it's in
appears?
book three, chapter 4 of the Guide for the Perplexed. That's where he
Thanks.
says that.
I'll look there. But
Yeah,
is it
take a look at-
someplace? Is it
take
in
a
our?
look at
Is it?
that.
Is it? I will do that. Is it? Thank you. Is it also in the text here? Because I don't
It is verse 6.
understand.
Yeah, it's in the text here.
Verse
too.
6.
Yeah.
So if you look at verse 6,
Okay.
the last is Venarot Hagalgal El Habor. Here you
Oh,
see
thank you. Okay.
the wheel is smashed at the cistern. So interesting, we also have Vitarut's Gulat, which is also Galgal. But yeah, we have a lot of these images, right? So I mean, a wheel, obviously the wheel of life, but also the wheels of Ezekiel's chariot. And what's the word for reincarnation in Kabbalah? Gilgul, right? We turning. So right, eventually in Kabbalah, when your silver cord is what leads you from life to life, right? You finish your life, one life, your jug is smashed, but then it's not the end. You go on to another life, and then another life, until you've made all the fixes to your being and are ready to return once and for all to your creator. And these verses, these verses are important throughout Jewish mysticism, because to some degree, a lot of mysticism comes out of thinking about death and what happens after life, and all of that. But the simple meaning, what the commentators think is all of this are images for life ending, right? Life is ending, and the end of physical life, and so what happens after the end of physical life. But the silver cord in Kabbalah it actually is interesting, because it has a lot of commonalities with other traditions that talk about the link to a person's soul being like a string, that your soul is inside of you in some degree, but there's a link in consciousness to one's soul that's like a silver cord or like a gold cord, and that links you in consciousness to a place that's eternal. And the more you strengthen that cord, the more your consciousness is connected to a place that's beyond the body.
And through contemplation, you can feel that, actually. You can feel something like that. You can feel some kind of a cord, I don't know, silver cord or a golden cord connecting you. Actually, I have a funny story about that. A long time ago, we did an interview with a person in a mental hospital, and he was traveling to the Akashic records, this guy. And he was leaving his body, he was traveling to the Akashic records. And this is about an 8-hour interview. I was called in because they knew that I was interested in this kind of Mishigas. Anyway, so there was a guy there who was with me. I asked him after the interview, I said, well, what do you think? Is the guy crazy, or is this something that is an experience that we should learn from? He says he's crazy. I said, why? Because his travels out of his body did not involve the silver or golden cord. Therefore, the guy is crazy. Anyway, I got a big kick out of that, because here was a so-called psychiatric diagnosis on the basis of a missing silver or golden cord, which was very interesting at that time. Anyway.
Thanks for sharing. Well, there's, there people often say, if one of the great teachers of humanity appeared today, would they end up in a mental institution? What would people think? And
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
People think about, there are conditions, right, where people have spiritual experiences, and if they don't have any understanding or support, they end up in a mental institution, and then it's kind of up to, a psychiatrist or a psychologist to, okay, how do you differentiate, right? That's a really interesting question between somebody who's having an experience we can call curious and spiritual, and that might be enlightening, rather than they're having a psychotic episode. Where's the line there, and how do you decide that? And finding someone who can decide that is probably a real gift for that person who might otherwise end up having an unpleasant life.
Well, in the old days, the patient and the doctor, they would talk about these things. But now they just give them pills.
Right, exactly, and it just shuts them.
Just to deaden them.
Yeah, exactly. It's really
Awful.
scary. Yeah, shuts them off.
Mhm.
They have pills that can shut down all these experiences, but
Right,
That's
right,
right.
right.
then you're shut off from your internal being, which, what does it do to you? But I had an uncle who spent his whole life in institutions because of and you just saw how the medication just deadened him. It was very, very painful to watch.
Very. And then they tell your parents to put your children on these medications.
Oh, yeah, when they're so young. Oh, it's terrible.
Yeah.
There was, I believe that there's a Pueblo tribe that would make bowls. And then when the person died, they put a hole in the bowl.
Oh,
So I see that as kind of, where you're talking about the jug being crashed by the cistern is kind of, seems similar to me.
It does feel that way. I mean, I really feel a strong connection between here and that chapter earlier of the seasons, right? There's a season there's a time for every season, a sense of life passing. And here we just have these series of images of, it's inevitable. In every life, there'll be war and there'll be peace. In every life, there'll be mourning and there'll be gladness. In every life, there'll be birth. In every life, there'll be death. And it makes sense to end Kohelet with, well, this is the end of physical life. I mean, what's the meaning of all of it, and where does it take us? And instead of saying futile, I like to go back to our original meaning here, precious, shallow breath, and hold on to all of it. And then we have this afterword, v'yoter, and a further word. Because Kohelet was a sage, he instructed people, he listened to and tested the soundness of many maxims. Kohelet sought to discover useful sayings and reported genuinely truthful things. Okay, why is he saying this? The sayings of the wise are like goods, right? Or the goads, the things you push sheep with to get them moving, prodding. They were given by one shepherd. Further word, against them, my son, be warned, the making of many books is without limit. Much study is a wearing in the flesh. So how do you have these verses together? On one hand, he's saying he had all these useful sayings, maxims, but then he's saying, be warned about them. And then
I think he's talking about the difference between practical wisdom, which Kohelet certainly had, at least from the perspective of a king. I mean, he didn't have practical wisdom from the perspective of a regular person, but from the perspective of a king, he had practical wisdom. But it's not the practical wisdom that he's trying to teach. I think the practical wisdom is sort of a cover for something else that he's trying to initiate in you, some kind of alterity, something very, very different from the usual life experience. So he's saying the making of many books is without limit. In other words, all my practical wisdom really isn't worth very much. I wrote it down. It's probably not worth very much. Studying isn't worth very much. But what is he saying is worth much? Is he saying he's not saying what is worth much? Well, my notion of what's worth much is contemplation, some kind of thinking about thinking about thinking. In fact, what the Oracle of Delphi told us is what the same thing that she told Socrates, and I'm going to reveal it right now. Is no, well, you always reveal secrets. Anyway, what she told us was know thyself, okay? And she's not talking about know who your mommy and daddy were and how you were treated when you were a little boy and how that turned into your personality. She's talking about the I, the center of you, the pure subject, the thing that's doing my thing that's doing the talking now. So the idea is you get to see if you can crack that thing open. See if you can figure out a way to open that thing. And the Greeks, by the way, had a word called periagogia, which was called introspection, but it also meant turning the eyes around in the head. So the way to get to know this thing, the way to get a look at it is to turn the eyes around in the head. Now, it's really tough to do that because the eyes are sort of fixed in the front, but you can fiddle with yourself. There are ways of fiddling with yourself to get a look at what's going on in the back of your head. And if you do that, it'll open up a channel to something which is interesting.
So there's a it is a sense of this book, which at the end, you know, can very much has that quality of that self-inquiry of what I would call, from point of world religion, as your Greek, but also Vedanta, the part of Hinduism that's Vedic, you know, says it's all about discovering self. And he said not the self, the personality, but the I, the beginning of every thought. If you retrace every thought to the very beginning, with that which is beyond it all, which also has that kind of Vedanta has that anti-intellectualism in it too. There's a limit to knowledge. Right? One of the things which came to my mind from that tradition is a teacher who said, you know, when you come about religion and God and the world, you know, when you come to a mango orchard, don't spend your whole time trying to count the mangoes and deciding how big the mangoes are. Pick the mango and eat it. And you know, so it's you know, this part of it which is taking us in that direction, where just eat the mangoes of life. You spend too much time counting them and sorting them and trying to describe them, and just eat the mango. And the mango is also God, you know, divinity. You know, don't spend your time trying to categorize what your theology is or what the this is, or just eat the mango. You know, be with it, and that current is there. It's why there's critiques of you know, there's why there's commentaries which see this book as being you know, Vedantic or Buddhist or any of those, which is, you know, just be in the moment. You know, all of life is transitory, but what is eternal is the moment, the being in the now, which he doesn't quite get there. He kind of gets there. He says, you know, just enjoy being with the woman you love, and just being in the moment, being in the now. But he doesn't quite leave us here that he kind of, everything was futile. And then we have this last comment, which is often ascribed to, again, all of this ascribed to an editor that came later. And he says, the sum of all the matter, when all is said and done, right? I'm going to, Kohelet, let me give the concluding verse to your book, right? Let me conclude your book, which it takes a lot of chutzpah, right? It's, you know, I'm going to take Shakespeare and then write the last line and say, at the end of all of it, this is what Shakespeare you really mean. But the sum of the matter, when all is said and done, revere God and observe his commandments. And this applies to all human beings. That God will call every creature to account for everything unknown, be it good or bad.
But in past chapters, Kohelet said the same thing.
Well, he also said, don't pay attention to the commandments. I mean, so
He said,
it's clear to me that the guy who came and wrote the last two lines here had anyway, he was a black hatter. He was a guy who was a serious traditionalist, and we couldn't have this go by without saying follow the commandments. So I don't think this has anything to do with Kohalas personally.
So he's a pious editor, as they sometimes call him. He's got a black hat, or in his day, whatever it was. Maybe in his day, it was not wearing a hat.
Yeah, maybe.
But he comes in. He says, "Revere God and observe His commandments." But I do want to take us away from just the piousness of revering commandments as the kind of end all and be all of life, and maybe look at it in a slightly different way. This is one of my end thoughts to all of this. I talked about it with my father too. Yesterday I was thinking about all of it. But this idea of maybe what kind of religion is Judaism? At the end of the day, we're a very positive religion, even though we have our Yiddish kind of sarcastic dour humor a little bit, but we're a very positive religion. I mean, how else would we have survived millennia of exile and millennia of all the things that happened to us? We're a very positive religion. We're a to life, l'chaim religion, right? L'chaim to life. In a sarcastic way, but also in a true way. We're not the religion of everything is just horrible and everything is breaking apart and there is no purpose to any of it. We're the religion of finding purpose, right? We're the religion of Viktor Frankl, who's Jewish but not that observant, seemingly. Who wrote Man in Search of Meaning, who's in the concentration camp and says, even in concentration camp, I find meaning, right? Even in a concentration camp, I look around and I don't just see that humanity is abhorrent and there's people lose it all, but I try and find a meaning in every little part of it. I don't just say life is chaotic, but I write that argument in the Talmud between Hillel and Shammai. Was it a good thing that man was created or not? Well, Judaism says, we're not sure, but since we're here, let's make the best of it, and let's be joyful, and let's focus on life, and let's try and letaken olam, to fix the world as we see it, which he never touches on, Kohelet never touches on. So the last line might also be traditional Judaism's discomfort a little bit with leaving it without a little bit of a positive. To them, to Judaism, this is a positive turn. Okay, well, it is true. Life is empty. Life is shallow. Life is a shallow breath. You never know what's going to happen. Elderly age comes more quickly than you can ever imagine it. But if you hold on to God, you've got something, right? If you're holding on to God, and this is where it can link with our earlier thoughts, if you hold on to what is maybe a metaphor we could use, as David has been saying, is above the sun, right? If you hold on to what is above the sun, if you hold on to what is eternal, then you've got something, right? And Kohelet never quite says it. So the editor says, well, I don't know if you mean it, Kohelet, but let me say it. Revere God is saying that, right? Revere God, hold on to God, you've got something. Even everything else is temporary. We can ask, where is family in all of this? Where is love of our loved ones here? But he's saying, hold on to God, and you've got something. Even if everything else seems like a waste of time, when you have God, at least you have hope, right? That's been part of our Jewish focus.
There's another piece to that, and that is that life is an open question. I mean, an open question, really an open question. And I think that's part of the design. We're not going to be able to get a synoptic view of life. We're not going to be able to totalize it, which means to understand it fully, to get our head around it, to be able to see it from the outside, package it up. It's going to be an open question. What an open question is as an opening. It's an opening. And you can't, I'm an old guy, so I'm telling you what I really think. But anyway, an opening is something that you reach towards and you keep reaching toward it. The way I think about it is there's an intrinsic puzzle in life. There's an intrinsic puzzle with this open question. In fact, somebody told me that Leo Strauss, when he used to come to his lectures, the first lecture, he'd put a question mark on the board, and then he put a question mark in front of the question mark. In other words, questioning the question. How is it possible that we are able to question and that we're even able to question the question? So there's some sort of infinite openness in us that allows us to do this. Anyway, and you're not going to be able to get the meaning of life. Okay, life has no meaning except it means what you say it is, actually, but its meaning is that it's an open question. That's it. And I think you have to satisfy yourself with the fact that you're not going to come to some conclusion about this. You're not going to be able to totalize the thing. It just isn't going to happen. And if you get that, then throw it out and try again, because you've arrived at the wrong place.
I like that. I think the book, it does leave it open, and maybe why this book is so meaningful to us and has kept being meaningful is because it speaks to that question mark that we all have about life. I mean, maybe why the editor came in and brought these 2 lines, because he didn't like too much of a question mark. Anybody else? Anybody else have any thoughts after reading this last chapter? Thoughts on the whole book? Thoughts on the question mark? Thoughts on where they're left with all of it?
Mine's more of a question, just what people think. Obviously, I missed a significant portion of the book, but so here's my question. Is it kind of apropos that he wrote this, given that he was a king and wealthy and that sort of thing? Because, we look at people in the world and we say, wow, they've got it all. Or like that poem, anybody who knows that poem, Richard Cory, I mean, it's kind of like that whole idea too, someone who has it all, and you look at them and you go, wow, I wish I was like them. But, kind of, through this whole thing, it's kind of like all the wealth and all the power and everything else like that really didn't give him the meaning that he was looking for in life. So this kind of a question I'm tossing out, is that kind of, I mean, that's the thought I have in my head. What are other people's thoughts on that? Or does that make sense? Or does that make sense?
Well, it's clear he had no answers. And it's clear that even with all the wealth and all that stuff, and the answer does not lie in how much accomplishments you have, how much money you've sealed up, how many women you've slept with, how many countries you've ruled. It doesn't lie in anything like that. And he's telling you that. He's saying, listen, I had all that stuff. And I'm still perplexed. And it's the answer lies in the being perplexed, if you could say that.
Well, he said he's perplexed, but even more, he says, whatever you try in the end leaves you empty, right? That's has been, right. Whatever you try leaves you empty in the end. So what should you seek in life? That question he doesn't really answer. What you should seek in life, he doesn't really, he doesn't answer, but he is, as you were saying, in a really good position to tell us whatever you try in the end leaves you empty, because most of us can't try everything we want to try from that materialistic way or even intellectual way, but he can, and he's tried it all, and he's the wisest man on earth, and he's got it all. So he's tried it all, and he says it all leaves you empty. And then it's kind of on one hand, you're balancing whatever you try leaves you empty in the end. And then when everything goes, what do you have left? So those two questions kind of leave you with maybe that contemplation. Everything goes, so what do you have left? And whatever you try leaves you empty. So what's left from those two questions? Not much. In fact, nothing. But
Well, but then, but if you take nothing as a concreteness, that's in fact what's left is no thing. Okay, an open question is nothing. That's what's left. Now, I don't know how that satisfies people. I get a kick out of that. I have to admit, I like that ending. It appeals to me, and it depends on your sentiment. It depends on the kind of person you are as to whether or not an open ending, a totally open ending as to what life is going to appeal to you. If you need, you know,
nothing is also everything, right? So at the beginning of creation of the whole Torah, which I think is appropriate if we're talking about the end, and now we're talking about the beginning. But the word for what was before creation, tohu vavohu, which is often translated as a desolate nothingness, or right before creation there was a nothing. But the Hasidic interpretation of tohu vavohu, vohu, can also be translated in Hebrew as bohu. In it he is, as in God, or consciousness. So in the nothingness before creation, he is, or I am that I am, or it is. So in some ways, that kind of links it all together, that reverence of God, or if you want to bring in the editor or not, but the nothingness isn't the chaotic nothingness, it's the nothingness of pure consciousness, right? He is. So these are very spiritual interpretations. Anybody have anything else, any other thoughts or leaves that they're left with at the very end as well?
I would say, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, the question mark that David introduced from Strauss, he said, is wrapped up, I think, in this text at the very end itself, one might say, because he says there's of the making of many books, there is no end, or however it says it here, Ein Kates, there is no end to that, no limit to the making of books. Now, what's he just done here? He's made another book. So he's saying, you know, I'm in my own, within my own logic. Why have I even written this book? And yet it's obviously something he wants to work out. And it reminds me of the famous so-called seventh letter of Plato. Now, last time I heard about it, it was believed to be authentic. I don't know now, but in there he says that you can't put philosophy down on paper, on whatever they used, because then it's frozen and fossilized, and it's the inquiry that goes on. And so that he's saying all of the dialogues that he's written, purporting to be of Socrates or not, that they're they are not the philosophy, they're not the end. So we're just making more books in a way. So we're left with that question mark.
Well, thank you for pointing out the in-kets, which is interesting because in all biblical books, we have traditions of finding the words that appear the most often. And in this book, you know, mitzvotav, commandments, almost never appears. Elohim, or God, almost never appears. But the words kets, of limit or ending, appears many times. The words harbe, which means a lot, or appears endless times. The words vanity, or you know, appears many times, or vanity, or breath, or however you want to look at it. The words my son appears quite a lot. He's talking a lot. The words wisdom appear a lot. So the words desires appear a lot. So by looking at all those words and how they're repeated, we get a sense of the tapestry that's being woven. And it is a tapestry that's taking us to the edge, it's taking us to the kets, it's taking us to the limit by loading on harbe, by loading on a lot. He's loading on everything, so many things he's loaded on to us to take us to the very limits of wisdom, to the limit of life, to the limit of everything. And and taking us to the shallow breath, and also taking us to joy, maybe the joy that's beyond all of it, beyond the shemesh. Anybody else have any concluding thoughts they want to mention? So I think we'll end here. Again, we'll keep thinking about it over the next few weeks. And the Passover, we'll if you want to join us, we'll have some concluding thoughts as we finish the book and read it again, because you reread this last verse, Sof Davar 13 to end the book, which we didn't do, so we can reread it and end the book halachically. And so next week I won't be here. I'll be in Toronto for a simcha, speaking of simcha, for a happy occasion, a bar and bat mitzvah for my family. And then I'm not sure what we'll do the following week. I may have another commitment, but in the week before, the Thursday before Passover, we're going to be looking in depth at the verses of the actual Exodus from the book of Exodus, and talking about that. And then maybe during Passover itself, we'll be reading the verses of the crossing of the sea, or maybe some other verses. And then once Passover is over, I'll have to think of what else we'll start studying.
What about the Song of Songs that you mentioned?
I know. I started reading.
That's a pretty iffy. That's a pretty risky thing to read in a group, I think.
I agree. I started reading it. I said too risky. So,
Well, but we're all old here.
we'll have a chavruta on it if you want. So and we'll report back. So we'll maybe too risky now, but
Do you know what you should do? If you do read, say, the first verse of that, you should send everybody the tract on ecstasy that I sent you some months ago, and I could do that too if you wanted to, by Dov Ber, who Dov Ber was the son of Schnorr Zalman, who was the head of the Chabad movement. Because to read those two things, the tract on ecstasy and Solomon's Song of Songs together is a real blast. I
was hoping to do something like that, but when you read the Song of Songs, it's just hard to get away from what it's actually talking about. So which is fine, it's great, it's got its value, but it's sometimes those interpretations are hard they're okay for a bit, but to read the whole book in that way is
the whole book is too much, but the first chapter isn't bad.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Everyone.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.
Rabbi.
Great
Everyone.
privilege. Great pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Fun.
Thanks a lot.